Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and certainly we're going to cover a lot of topics, as we always do. First hour, we're going to be in the news, and of course, we have a recall election in California, so I'll give you just a little bit of information about that. And those of you in California, you might try not to be bored for a minute, because I do want to educate the rest of the country about what is happening in your state. We then have some articles about everything from inflation to increases in taxes, if indeed Congress has its way. What does that mean? Some interesting things coming down about not only the vaccines, but whether or not some of the statistics we've been using for COVID-19 are inaccurate. I know that might surprise you, but this doesn't come from the typical source. A lot of people right now are reprinting and sending around a piece that comes from Atlantic, which tend to be a little more left of center as a magazine, but nevertheless raising some questions that many of us around the table have raised before, so we'll get into some of that. And then in the next hour, we'll be talking with J. Warner Wallace. This is his new book, A Person of Interest, and I think you're really going to enjoy this, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible, in which he uses his ability as a cold have any Greek manuscripts, and we just had, if you will, the evidence that you have oftentimes like in a crime scene. What about this? The fuse and the fallout. I think you're going to really appreciate this. I think this may be his best book, although certainly he's written some very good ones. And while we're talking about apologetics, I did post today some information about a book by Eric Metaxas coming out next month on Is Atheism Dead? It is looking like a really good book. We have the, if you will, kind of reprint of part of his argument that appeared in the stream, so that's on the website as well. So we've got a lot to cover, so let's, if we can, get to that. And the first is to talk about this recall election. We will probably know a lot more about it in the next few hours, and certainly tonight. I've never really had the assumption that indeed Gavin Newsom would be recalled. If you look at the track record, not good. We've had 55 different attempts to recall a governor in the state of California. Only one success, and that was where there was a recall in 2003 to unseat Democrat Gray Davis, in which Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor, and you might remember that. So it is very unlikely, but nevertheless, let me just give you a few facts, because this will be something that we'll hear about over the next couple of days. I suspect arguments being made that this shows that Republicans will not do well in the 2022 elections. I think it has no impact whatsoever in that. That shows that people still want Gavin Newsom to continue with these lockdowns. No, I don't think it means that either, but nevertheless, let's again talk about a recall. Those who were behind it first were pretty much Republicans, but didn't really get any momentum until really the pandemic hit. And then there were people very upset about some of the things the governor called for. You then have a number of high-profile Democrats that joined with that as well. Los Angeles County Sheriff and one former Senate leader and a few others. But still, it is something that requires about 12% of valid registered voters from the last governor's election to signed the petition. That indeed took place, and so it asked a series of questions. Question number one, shall Gavin Newsom be recalled? If the answer is yes, then the voters are asked to choose a candidate listed below, and whoever has the most votes is the winner. It is, I think, a little bit unfair if you think about it in a democratic sense, because you might have 51%. You won't, but I'll just say hypothetically you could have 51% or 50% plus one that want to recall him, and then be elected by somebody that has 20% of the populace. And so because you have, what is it now? I forget how many we have, 46 candidates. You've heard of a few of those, people like Larry Elder, maybe John Cox, both of whom we've interviewed on this program, Caitlyn Jenner. But as I pointed out before, pretty unlikely that this will result in anything other than the one thing that I have wanted to focus some time and attention on, and that is the evidence possibly of additional voter fraud. There are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we yesterday shared a few of those stories, but a particular concern is that you can print your ballot online. Oh, what could possibly go wrong there? So I think we may, over the next few days, have some people complaining about this, maybe even whining, as one commentator said. But it might also prove to show that this idea of voter fraud, which you always say never takes place, so we have maybe some abundant examples of the fact that it did take place in the state of California. And that's exactly why we have tried to pass some of these voter integrity laws. Well, let's move on from that, because we have a lot more to cover. And first of all, our first article today is Inflation is Rising. This comes, first of all, from a survey which I mentioned yesterday, but now even the Federal Reserve, at least the New York Federal Reserve, and recognize there are different member banks, but New York Federal Reserve now says that inflation is probably at 5.2% in 1 year, and then maybe an additional 4% in the next 3 years. So they expect increases in prices for food, rent, medical costs, and much more. Now, you have had some various individuals actually comment about this. Senator Tim Scott, who, of course, is not only the senator from South Carolina, but I think an odds-on presidential candidate, he tweeted out, inflation at a 30-year high, consumer confidence is plummeting, American families are worried about their bottom lines. These are the disastrous consequences of Bidenomics. And so he's, of course, going to use that to maybe establish why he should be the nominee for the Republican Party running against Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, or whoever runs a couple of years from now. Stephen Moore has been on the program with us a couple of times, put it this way. Consumer price index rose 8.3% in August, highest inflation in 30 years. But don't worry, Biden and Powell say it's transitory. He goes, yeah, right. And, of course, one of the things we will talk about after the break is that one of the things that has fueled inflation, and one of the reasons why a booklet we'll be sending to many of you donors very soon on money, is the inflation that has come from the inflation of the money supply. That's part of it. Some of it also has to do with the impact that it has already the impact, I should say, really, of the pandemic on supply chains. And so some of that is taking place. And there are a variety of other issues. But also looking down the road, if you do increase the taxes, which we'll talk about after the break, in order to pay for this $3.5 trillion budget, we now have some pretty good evidence of what this is going to look like, because I love how the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal said it. It's been under wraps longer than some Egyptian mummies, but the bill for the Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Bernie Sanders spending agenda is about to be exposed in the air. So when we come back from the break, I'll give you just a couple of facts and figures. I know sometimes it tends to be a little boring to talk about numbers, but we are talking about your taxes, and we're talking about the impact that it will have on consumer prices. And certainly, even as you raise the taxes on corporations, ultimately, directly or indirectly, you pay for that as well. So let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Rod Dreyer has been writing about the plight of Princeton professor Joshua Katz. He has been attacked by students, faculty, and administration over his public dissent of attempts to give additional benefits to Princeton faculty of color, additional salaries, or sabbatical semesters. Dreyer, as you may remember, is the author of the book Live Not by Lies that describes the similarity of communist countries that attacked anyone who engaged in dissent from the totalitarian orthodoxy. That was what he called hard totalitarianism. Today, he argues, we have soft totalitarianism practiced on college campuses, by social media platforms, and by woke companies. Professor Katz is a distinguished classic professor with tenure. Therefore, it is harder for the university to cancel him. Instead, the university directs incoming freshmen to read about him on the university website, in which Professor Katz is introduced to them as one of the most evil people on campus. The same week this article appeared, there were notable examples of people being canceled. For example, Army General Michael Flynn was notified by Chase Bank that they were going to cancel his credit cards because he posed a possible reputational risk to our company. Once that story hit the news, the company claimed their letter was a mistake. Candace Owens received an email from a COVID testing facility refusing her service because of her politics. Of course, she could merely go to another clinic to get a COVID test, but we also know that you are not allowed to decline to bake a cake or provide flowers for a same-sex wedding ceremony. These are just a few examples of how soft totalitarianism is surfacing in nearly every part of American society. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just for a few minutes talk about some of the tax issues that might affect you. And then there was quite a gala last night at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I've seen it once, I've seen it at least a half a dozen times. The picture of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, wearing a dress that says "Tax the Rich," which I thought was pretty interesting because if you are not familiar, there was a time a few decades ago when maybe the party of the rich were Republicans, maybe the time when Ronald Reagan was governor and ran for president, but that is no longer the true case. I mean, almost all the major billionaires that contribute to political campaigns are giving to the Democrats. So it has become the party of the rich. So it is interesting that she did that. But also, Charles Cook raises an interesting question. Why is it that all of the celebrities there were without masks, and all of the servants were with masks? All the servers were. And of course, it brings us to something we've talked about many times before. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But while we're talking about taxes and taxing the rich, as the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it, this tax plan has been under wraps almost as long as the Egyptian mummies. And not everybody's happy because now there was going to be testimony in front of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. And the chairman was very upset about this because he says this now gives the opportunity for people to maybe have some opposition to it. So much for this idea of transparency. I mean, you're going to be paying these taxes, but we really don't want you to know till the final hours how those taxes are going to be levied. And of course, you've heard the former Speaker of the House and current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, because for a while she was not Speaker of the House, but is currently now. But back then saying, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. But if you look at this, almost everybody writing about this points out the obvious, and that is if you look at the share of GDP, this would be the largest tax increase since 1968. And that doesn't even account for, as they point out here, and you can read this a little bit more if you'd like to in some of the articles, that the Senate Finance Committee has some other ideas to add to it as well. So they said this is sort of like an all-you-can-eat politician's dinner at Applebee's or at whatever particular group you want to talk about. Top individual tax rate will increase from to 39.6% from 37%. But more than that, it also lowers the threshold by which that happens, much lower than one by Joe Biden, in part because they recognize they need to come up with money. By the way, this plan supposedly brings in $2.2 trillion, but the budget is $3.5 trillion. And you can do the math and recognize that even by raising all these taxes, and by the way, when you raise the tax rate, people sometimes don't pay it. So even if you assume that you put a gun to the head of these individuals and they now have to pay the higher tax rate, you don't even come close to funding the federal government, even with all of these. But let's go on. There is a 3 percentage point income tax surcharge for people at the top rate. When you add that to those who already pay taxes in, say, California and New York, that makes the upper limit at about a 60% tax rate. And what happens at that point is the people don't necessarily pay 60%. They just don't engage in the kind of activity that would put them in that tax bracket, or they find ways to shield it or whatever it might be. But then again, you can look at the fact that even the individual tax rate in some cases would affect, for example, small businesses, which would pay a surcharge and a number of other things. They have actually cut what is called the exemption on the death tax actually in half. And then corporations would actually come in, as they say, for about a $900 billion fleecing, with the top rate rising to 26.5%. If you add state and corporate and other local corporate levies, that's up to 31%. You might remember yesterday I pointed out that this would, first of all, be the highest corporate tax rate in the world, even higher than communist China. So that is how you pay for this, and it's an illustration, again, of some of the things that are a source of real concern for some of our individuals that are trying to keep the doors open in their small business. Let me, just before I take a break, though, talk about the point that was made by Charles Cook. He's got a picture here of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wearing the tax the rich dress, but he raises a bigger question, and that is all of the guests were actually walking around without a mask in New York City, but all the wait staff were wearing masks. And so, first of all, what about that? And he says, well, the guests were obliged to be vaccinated, okay, but so were the staff. So the website affirms that as August 17th, people of 12 and older are required to show proof they've received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine or whatever. And, of course, this applies to movie theaters, music, concert venues, museums, which is what that is. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is a museum. And so the question was, okay, the staff had to wear masks and the celebrities did not. And so he asked the question, is the science different for famous people, perhaps? He said the other option, I suppose, is the Met made an exception, allowed unvaccinated staff to work at the event. If so, the same question obtains because we were just told by the president that unvaccinated people pose a risk to vaccinated people, and that would mean that still the guests should wear a mask. And so Charles Cook raising the question about, of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala is reminiscent of, let's bring us back to California for just a minute, when you might remember that Governor Gavin Newsom was seen actually laughing and maskless at a birthday party for a powerful lobbyist up there in Napa, California. This was just 1 month after he told the public to keep your mask on in between bites, and obviously he was not eating. By the way, I'm reading some of this from Glenn Greenwald, who reminds us of some of that. Then he goes on to move from Gavin Newsom in Napa, California, to Nancy Pelosi in Napa, California, where she had an event with a number of wealthy Democrat donors in the same wine region, he says, of Governor Newsom's dinner party. By the way, the cheapest tickets there were $100 each, but if you have the chair designation, that ticket for that meal cost you $29,000. Again, don't tell me the Democratic Party is not the party of the wealthy today. They had outdoor activities. Most of the people sitting around were maskless, and since race is supposed to be a big issue these days, mostly white Democrat donors. But if you look up, you noticed that although there was not a mask in sight for these Democrat donors, as Glenn Greenwald puts it, servants apparently are much more pleasant when they are dehumanized. There was no need for noses or mouths or other identifiable facial features for those who were actually, he says, converted into servile robots. And so you have Gavin Newsom, you have Nancy Pelosi. Let's not leave out, of course, former President Barack Obama, because you might remember he had a very lavish birthday party as well. And when the criticism came in there, again, Glenn Greenwald reminds us that there was a New York Times reporter, Annie Carney, who explained that while some of the former president's neighbors found the party objectionable on the grounds of health or maybe even on terms of optics, many adamantly argued that such concerns were only applicable to ordinary people, not these more advanced individuals as well. Here's the direct quote that appeared in the New York Times. "The controversy," she said, this is Annie Carney, "is really overblown. They're following all the safety requirements. People are going to sporting events that are bigger than this. This is going to be safe because, after all, this is what? A sophisticated, vaccinated crowd, and it's just about optics. It's not about safety." There are more and more pieces of evidence surfacing almost every day about the fact that, well, these are powerful lobbyists. These are Democratic donors. These are very sophisticated, vaccinated people in the crowd. So the rules that we are applying to you do not apply to them. And I might just say that, not that I have that much interest in the Metropolitan Museum of the Art Gala, other than the fact that every time you go to a website, you see a picture of AOC wearing her Tax the Rich dress. The really interesting thing, which I think for us is, especially when we start now after the break talking about these issues of vaccines, is that it does seem to be an assumption that if you're wealthy, if you are a celebrity, if you're a politician, the rules that apply to us don't apparently apply to them. We can come back from a break, though, and maybe first spend some time with Atlantic Magazine, not necessarily one that has been too critical of some of the COVID-19 statistics, but this particular article is going viral, and I think it also illustrates some of the other points we want to try to make in this last half hour before we have a chance to hear with our good friend, Dr. J. Warner Wallace. We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference: Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, there's been a lot of controversy about the vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, hospitalization, the virus itself, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the restrictions, what worked and what doesn't work. And so for the next two segments, next half hour here, I want to try to work our way through some of this material. One of the articles that I've posted for you to read, it's the second article. I called it Mandates, Vaccines, and Immunity. The actual article is called Make War, Get War, but it's, all about the mandate. But it brings out some points, but I want to argue to those points, because if you hear them, you go, well, they're just reacting, but they aren't using good science to come to that conclusion. It's written by Angelo Codevilla, and he's a philosopher and a very good writer, and I do think what we will get to in a few minutes with him will, I think, maybe bring some clarity. But as we go through this, one of the frustrations is this whole issue of the vaccine, the virus, the pandemic, the lockdowns have been so politicized. And there is more and more evidence, to me at least, that you need a little bit more of a nuance. The world has got a lot of gray in it. It's not all gray or black and whites. But a year and a half ago, we were hearing people making statements about masks. Masks don't work, or masks perfectly work. And it's like, no, neither of those are exactly true. When we were being told, for example, that we didn't need to have a mask, we even brought a person on to spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that no, masks aren't going to be totally perfected and actually protect all individuals, but it's kind of fallacious to have the Surgeon General and Anthony Fauci and others suggest that, no, you don't need to wear a mask because we need to make those available for the health professionals. Excuse me? You just undercut your argument. There's one which we'll get to a little bit later that comes from a Harvard epidemiologist who also has pointed out that although the vaccine is helpful, it is not the silver bullet. It's not the panacea that you would expect it to be, and we'll explain why in just a few minutes. I think his line is, the idea that everyone needs to be vaccinated is as baseless as the idea that nobody does. This, of course, always runs in the face of people that always want it all or nothing. And I think what you're going to find as we work our way through this, not necessarily the case. Let's first of all give credit to Atlantic. Now, they're not the first, because Red State, Scott Hounsel, has talked about this, and I've got his piece in front of me here. The Intercept, also, I quoted from that the other day, did quote that, and the Daily Mail. But the Atlantic is the one everybody's quoting because, after all, Atlantic, you would be sure, would be always on the side of Joe Biden, Anthony Fauci, CDC, and the rest. And they're not against them, but they're simply, the title of the article is, Our Most Reliable Pandemic Number is Losing Meaning. What they mean is that the hospitalization numbers are very misleading. And that's important to know, because I cannot think of even a local television broadcast that I've listened to where they don't talk about the number of people in hospitals is up significantly. Now, why would they, or why would Scott Hounsel at Red State, why would people at the Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, I quoted him before, the Daily Mail there in UK, why would they say all of that? And it turns out that the way in which the CDC and the NIH collect information is not standardized. And so there is becoming more and more evidence of the fact that many of the people that are in the hospital, if they test for positive for COVID, even if they're in for other kind of surgery, are listed as COVID patients. Now, again, let me just quote from Atlantic. I want to give them props, because when they come out and say something that we agree with, we want to give them all the credit in the world. They said, in order to make sense of the number of COVID hospitalizations at any given time, you need to know how sick each patient is, but until now it's been almost impossible to figure that out. The federal government requires hospitals to report every patient who tests is positive for COVID, yet the overall tallies, they say, of COVID hospitalizations made available on various state and federal dashboards and widely reported by the media do not differentiate between the severity of the illness. Some patients need extensive medical intervention, such as being intubated. Others need supplemental oxygen or administration of various steroids. By the way, if you want to say, well, all of these are extended too far, no, we've had an individual who's been on this program with us who has been in ICU for almost 2 months, so obviously some of these people are in that very desperate circumstance. But there are other COVID patients, they say, with fairly mild symptoms that have been admitted for further observation. And then another portion of the patients in this tally are in the hospital for something unrelated to COVID and discovered that they were infected only because they were tested upon admission. Does that help you understand? So there's categories here. The people that are really in a bad situation, one of our friends, Gary, has been in a very difficult situation for a long time, all the way to people that maybe were getting a knee replacement, but then tested positive for COVID. Okay, you with me on that? Okay, so when people have tried to do a survey of this, I will now quote from another survey. This one comes from the VA Boston healthcare system. They tried to say, well, can we provide a line where we would at least have a differentiation between people that have significant issues and people who just merely tested positive for COVID. Once they began to do that, they noticed that the numbers dropped. No surprise. For example, if they looked at hospitalized patients who required supplemental oxygen, and they found that the percentages dropped from 64% to 52%, they went on to also recognize that probably, this was their estimate, 36% of the patients who were admitted to the hospital had mild or were even asymptomatic. So that is something to keep track of when you see those numbers. Not saying anybody's being deceptive, but they are not making the kind of discrimination that is necessary. Now, leave it to Scott Hounsell to point out something else. Is there a reason why this would be done in that regard? And he at least says that it is at least possible that we know that COVID hospitalizations are reimbursed at a higher rate than your typical health insurance plan. And Congress, of course, has set aside $100 billion for hospitals from the CARES Act. So again, if you have a patient in a bed, you get paid. If you have a patient that is got COVID, you get paid more. If you have an empty bed, you get nothing. So, not again making any allegations, although I suspect he is with his question, but it's something to think through very carefully. Let's take something else. One of the things that has become the very big issue over the last couple of days is whether or not people that have been vaccinated, whether they are at risk from people that are unvaccinated. Of course, you heard that from President Joe Biden. Well, now the vice president has weighed in with her comments as well. Kamala Harris, I've got her tweet right in front of me here. By vaccinating the unvaccinated, increasing our testing and masking, and protecting the vaccinated, we can end the pandemic. That's exactly what we're committed to. Now, again, you have all sorts of people. I'll just quote from Kaylee McGee White, writing in the Washington Examiner, who says that's just not true. They're not at risk. And she argues that multiple studies have shown that individuals are indeed protected with the vaccine from even the virus's mutations, including the Delta variant. In other words, vaccinated adults no longer need to fear COVID-19. They're more likely to die from a car crash or a bee sting or a dog attack than from COVID-19. And yet still, the vice president and the president want to have vaccinated people believe that they're at risk. Now, is it possible that a person who is vaccinated who then comes down with COVID would face serious problems? Well, again, one of the individuals we've interviewed here, a doctor who we actually asked lots of questions about COVID, actually, of course, got the vaccine because he was promoting it, and then got COVID, and then he died. So, yes, there are people that sometimes die even with the vaccine, even when they get COVID through breakthrough, but the reality is that that is nothing like like what is being presented right now. And again, this whole discussion about vaccinating the unvaccinated is, of course, based on the assumption that the only way we'll ever be able to completely get rid of this pandemic is to make sure everybody is vaccinated. Of course, as I mentioned on Friday, the argument is 80 million people are not vaccinated. I'll come back to how many of those maybe have natural immunity, but that doesn't even count the 50 million children that aren't vaccinated and all the other people that would be coming here from other countries that do. But we won't get into that other than to ask the other question that is now surfaced in all sorts of surveys. Why is it that most vaccines last for a lifetime and the COVID-19 shots do not? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, and then next hour we're going to have a chance to hear from J. Warner Wallace. We'll get back into some of these things about the virus and the vaccines and everything tomorrow as well. Also, we will have Chelsea Ullman with us, and we'll be talking about the abortion issue, because certainly she is quite an expert on that. She's been interviewed by all sorts of people all over the country about the heartbeat bill. I thought it'd be good for us to hear from her, and oftentimes she's in the host chair, so this time we'll put her in in the guest chair and ask her some questions and get your comments. If you go to the second article, which I mentioned by Angelo Codevilla, he is more of a philosopher, but he does talk about the fact that the argument being used right now by the administration is that people that are vaccinated, including, I gather from the way he says it himself, have to be protected from the unvaccinated. But he says, well, then how long would these vaccines actually last, and how long are you immune? He does quote from one article, which I'm going to get into in just a minute, in which we do actually have an answer for why these vaccines, and I'm really more calling them treatments because they're not like a typical vaccine. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the idea is that given the fact that they don't last very long, we would have to have another booster. You know, you've been hearing already about, well, everybody needs to get a booster shot, and now they're talking about whether you'd have to get an annual booster shot. So he spends some time talking about that as well. So you might say, well, what is the deal here? And so he quotes from a piece that is written by Joe Craven McGinty. So I've got it in front of me here, and ask a very good question. She asks, why don't COVID-19 vaccinations last longer? After all, measles shot is good for life. Chicken pox immunizations protect for 10, maybe 20 years. Tetanus shots usually for a decade or so. You know, if you've ever hurt yourself and maybe hit something that was rusty, they want to know, when's the last time you had a tetanus shot? And if you said, 5 years ago, you're good. But if you say 20 years ago, or I don't remember, then they want to give you a tetanus shot. So the bottom line is, one of these professors at Emory University said a really good vaccine makes it so somebody does not get infected even if they are exposed to the virus. But not all vaccines, he says, are what? Ideal. The effectiveness depends on three things. I'm not going to get too scientific here, but the magnitude of the immune response, how fast the antibodies decay, and whether the virus or the bacteria tends to mutate. Well, I'll bring you bad news. You know, when you're talking about COVID-19, all of those suggest that it probably will have a durability no better than the flu shot that you normally get. With some of the diseases like, say, measles, the magnitude of that went for some time. For example, even the measles antibodies decay fairly slowly. Tetanus antibodies decay more quickly, but the vaccine causes the body to produce more. So you have all sorts of other kinds of vaccines, whether it is HPV, hepatitis A, typhus, tetanus, all sorts of things that are more durable, but the COVID-19 is not. You got another issue, and that is most of you in the listening audience probably have either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, and that is an mRNA, a messenger RNA vaccine, which doesn't contain any virus at all. That may be good in terms of safety, but it's different than, say, the typical one, which uses an attenuated virus, or even the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine uses non-replicating viruses. And so the difference is, when you look at some things like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, they hardly mutate at all. But if you look at the 8 variances so far of what we now call SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, we have at least 8 of those individuals out there. And so just as the flu mutates, and you almost always, if you want to get a flu vaccine, have to get a next one every year, we're kind of in the same situation. And that also brings us to another point about herd immunity. One of the other people I'll quote is a doctor who says vaccines are very likely to lead to long-lasting herd immunity, but not for ones that are respiratory infections. Instead, vaccines for respiratory infections are very unlikely to lead to herd immunity. And frankly, herd immunity only lasts for a modest period of time. It depends on how fast the virus changes. And I won't get into the technicalities here, but those of you that have a medical background recognize that you have the way in which coronaviruses replicate in both the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Well, you do have some antibodies in the lower respiratory tracts, but not so much in the upper. And so there are all sorts of reasons to suggest that this claim that, first of all, once we get everybody vaccinated, the pandemic will go away. No, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but don't take my word for it. For those of you watching online, I'm holding up this particular journal article from Nature, which is the premier science journal of the UK, in which they actually ask 100 immunologists, infectious disease researchers, and virologists, and nearly 90%, I guess it turned out to be 89% of them, felt that it was quite likely that the coronavirus will be endemic. What is endemic? It's going to be around. It's not leaving anytime soon. Lest you think that's just a one-off, here's the one from Harvard University's School of Public Health, and questioning those issues as well, and hoping that maybe through natural immunity, people will eventually gain enough protection that there will be some that will come from vaccination, most from natural immunity. And of course, that depends, as we just depended on, such as the strength and duration of the immune protection, which is now being somewhat challenged. Which brings me to the final piece that I have here, where as helpful as having the actual vaccine is, there is, and this is something coming out of Harvard now, and originally the study came out of Israel, found that those people who were vaccinated were 27 times more likely to get a subsequent COVID infection. So while it is something that can really protect the individuals that are going to have comorbidities and those kinds of things, the reality is sometimes people have been asking lately, why is it that then after a person gets a vaccine, he or she then gets COVID again? And it does seem to be from this study that came from Israel that, again, vaccinated individuals, I'm reading for the study, had a 27 times higher risk of symptomatic COVID infection compared with those with natural immunity, which is why, again, a lot of people have talked about the fact that maybe the ultimate answer comes from natural immunity. But as I pointed out just the other day, when you raise that question, as a matter of fact was raised by Sanjay Gupta, who is kind of the medical expert for CNN, when he raised that question with Anthony Fauci, you got kind of a, really haven't thought about it very much. And I think you're going to have to think about it a little bit more, which has led this one Harvard professor to say, look, the idea that everyone needs to be vaccinated is as baseless as the idea that nobody does, because he makes the case that individuals that are at risk need the vaccine, but at the same time, there are other individuals which possibly could be asymptomatic. And the best way to look at that is that according to the CDC, 60 million people have actually been diagnosed as having the COVID infection, but the CDC estimates that probably 100 million people actually have had COVID, which would suggest then, actually, I got the numbers back. It's 40 million cases of COVID, 100 million that have it, which would suggest that maybe 60% of Americans were asymptomatic. Back to the numbers used by the president, 80 million people haven't been vaccinated. I guess at least half of them or more might actually have natural immunity. But you don't hear that in the mainstream media or from the administration. Let's take a break, though. J. Warner Wallace with us next, and we'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped, agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View, you know that we spend a fair amount of time not only helping you know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but how to defend a biblical worldview. And that defense of the biblical worldview, of course, is known as apologetics, how we defend the Christian faith. And one of the key elements of that is, why should I even be concerned about who Jesus is? And what about his influence? And this is, in a sense, the summary of this book, Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World that Rejects the Bible. It is written by our good friend J. Warner Wallace, and of course I've loved all of his books, but this one, almost like a magnum opus, it pulls together so many different aspects of study. I've seen him write that he's never worked harder on any other book than this, and it shows. Now I'm going to frustrate you, because as we are broadcasting this today, and maybe we'll rebroadcast this later, the book is not out yet, but it will be, and so you're going to want to maybe pre-order the book. I have in front of me here what is called an advanced reading copy, and I've been so impressed with the book, and you will figure out why as we work our way through this. But again, if you're not familiar with J. Warner Wallace, he served, of course, as a cold case homicide detective. Many of you might even remember him from television. As we have talked about before, he has both undergraduate and graduate work in design and architecture, which shows up in all of his books. The diagrams and the illustrations, so well done. And if you're a visual learner, like I suspect many of you are, you will benefit from that. And even though he was in that field, decided to go back into the field of his father, and that is law enforcement. But this has been very helpful, because as an individual that grew up as a vocal atheist and then became a Christian, he has applied and has able to apply the same kind of evidential work that he has developed, of course, working in law enforcement. But after becoming a Christian, did get his master's degree in theological studies from Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary, served for a while as a youth pastor, planted a church, but we are the better beneficiaries of the fact that he travels quite a bit now and teaches these programs and has such a creative way of communicating this. So, Jim Wallace, always great to have you on the program.
Well, I've been looking so forward to talking to you. It is frustrating, right, when you don't have an actual book that's available yet, but what can you do? We are trying to set it up for pre-order, though, and we've got hopefully a pretty good pre-order bonus package for anybody who orders it. But I just so appreciate you having me on.
Well, also, I appreciate the package, because those of you on Instagram can see some of the material. And I think it's fair to say you have poured your life into this. This is just an incredible book. Any of your books are great, but we are talking about looking at Jesus, the influence in terms of art and history and architecture, his contemporaries, and all sorts of other elements that you bring together. So it's more than just doing a cold case evaluation of Jesus. We are going to be learning all sorts of very important principles. Of course, one of those, the fuse and the fallout, but you've packed a lot more into this than I expected until I started opening up the book and working my way through the 300 pages.
Well, I'll tell you, I wonder sometimes for a lot of us who are writers and speakers, what for the coronavirus year of lockdown, I wonder if I would have even been able to do it, right? Because I knew from my own journey, like I walked into this church years ago with my wife, and I was not a believer, not interested in Jesus, but this pastor was clever enough to pitch Jesus as the smartest person who ever lived. That was his claim. And that started me on this journey. I've written about half of it in a book called Cold Case Christianity, but I also spent a lot of time kind of looking outside for the external evidence. Like I didn't really trust anything that had to do with Scripture. So I knew that if you could make a case for Jesus, you'd have to make it with me, as if there's no Scripture at all. You'd have to make it, I mean, if this is so obvious that this is the Son of God, this is God incarnate on planet Earth, well, I'd have to be able to have some evidence of that outside of the Christian Scriptures. So a lot of what I'm trying to travel through in this book is all the work I did, many years ago. But I'll tell you, years ago when I did this for myself, you're not sourcing stuff. You're not going back and digging through four or five layers of sources that can be put in footnotes and case notes and all of that. And my goodness, if it hadn't been for coronavirus year where we spent so many days kind of locked down, and here in California everything was pretty much closed, so it would really provided me the opportunity to write a book like this. I don't know how it would have happened otherwise.
Well, again, I so appreciate it. Let's start out because, again, you give us a case, and this one is Steve and Tammy, and this is where we start learning the principle of the fuse and the fallout. Now, I'll let you explain that in just a minute. Steve, many people were convinced probably killed his wife, but you don't have a body. You don't have anybody that saw the action. You've never found the body for Tammy, and so in some respects, you're assigned a very difficult case, which, again, they love to give to you. And so that causes you to begin to evaluate their case, which you carry all the way through the particular book. But in so doing, then using that to surface in 10 different chapters some things that we can learn about Jesus. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, so a lot of times, I've had a couple of these now where a husband will kill his wife and then get rid of her body and then claim that she ran off. And the first officers, if they're not maybe investigative enough or curious enough, they'll take that report and it'll be eventually assigned to a detective. And sometimes years go by, and if you convince the detective that, no, she's the kind of person who would just run off, you don't have a body, you have no reason to believe this is a murder yet. And I've had a couple of these where it's been many years, and there was never any pictures taken on the day of the murder because they didn't think it was a murder. And then 5 or 6 years later, they're thinking, oh, you know what, she never returned, and she had small children, and she would have at least contacted them, and this didn't happen, and people start to become suspicious. And so now you have a murder investigation, and sadly, you don't have any pieces of physical evidence because they didn't investigate it like a murder to begin with. You got no crime scene. You got that maybe he moved from that house, he cleaned everything up, he moves from the house, now it's 6 years later. What are you going to do? You got even have the body to demonstrate to a jury that this is a murder. And so when you get in front of a jury on those kinds of cases, and as you're investigating them, you think about the day of the murder as like a bomb that went off. Something explosive happened on that day. If you're right, if this is actually a murder, but that means that typically you have a long fuse that burns toward any bomb of this nature. That the situation got worse and worse between the husband and the wife, and the passions escalated and anger escalated, and now a plan is formed. There's a fuse that burns toward any bomb. And after the bomb explodes, you've got a bunch of shrapnel all over the place from pieces of the bomb. So I always tell juries that if we're going to make this case, I'm going to show you what happened on the day of the explosion. Even though I have nothing from the actual crime scene, I'm going to show you what happened on the day of the explosion by simply tracing for you the impact of the fuse and the fallout. So this is a way for us to take a look at crimes in which we have no crime scenes. How can we make the cases? It's fuse and fallout. It's always fuse and fallout. So I thought, well, look, if Jesus is who he said he was, I shouldn't have to, if there was an empty crime scene, in other words, no document evidence, you destroyed every single New Testament, every single manuscript leading to a New Testament, all of it's been cleverly destroyed by some nefarious dystopian future regime. Okay, could you still make a case for Jesus based on the fuse and fallout of history centered on this explosive event, whatever it was, that changed what was before the Common Era into the Common Era, or BC into AD? Something changed that calendar moment, and so the question becomes, if I knew nothing from manuscript evidence, if I knew nothing from the copies of the Bible, I could still make a case.
And that is exactly the first chapter, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some examples of the fuse and then the fallout right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Rod Dreyer has been writing about the plight of Princeton professor Joshua Katz. He has been attacked by students, faculty, and administration over his public dissent of attempts to give additional benefits to Princeton faculty of color, additional salaries, or sabbatical semesters. Dreyer, as you may remember, is the author of the book Live Not by Lies that describes the similarity of communist countries that attacked anyone who engaged in dissent from the totalitarian orthodoxy. That was what he called hard totalitarianism. Today, he argues, we have soft totalitarianism practiced on college campuses, by social media platforms, and by woke companies. Professor Katz is a distinguished classic professor with tenure. Therefore, it is harder for the university to cancel him. Instead, the university directs incoming freshmen to read about him on the university website, in which Professor Katz is introduced to them as one of the most evil people on campus. The same week this article appeared, there were notable examples of people being canceled. For example, Army General Michael Flynn was notified by Chase Bank that they were going to cancel his credit cards because he posed a possible reputational risk to our company. Once that story hit the news, the company claimed their letter was a mistake. Candace Owens received an email from a COVID testing facility refusing her service because of her politics. Of course, she could merely go to another clinic to get a COVID test, but we also know that you are not allowed to decline to bake a cake or provide flowers for a same-sex wedding ceremony. These are just a few examples of how soft totalitarianism is surfacing in nearly every part of American society. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with J. Warner Wallace, Person of Interest, and this is a book coming out with Zondervan. And again, if you want to try to understand this, you might even want to take some notes. Fuse and fallout. You know, the fuse is lit and before the bomb explodes, and then what's the fallout afterwards? So we're going to look at the fuse before Jesus arrives on the scene. And one of the things you talk about in the second chapter is the cultural fuse. What was the world like before Jesus arrived? What was it like when he did arrive? And that really helps us understand some of the cultural context, including everything from alphabets to the Pax Romana and a variety of others that actually precede the arrival of the Son of God.
Yeah, I think you could actually make a case that if you were just looking at all the stuff that occurred in antiquity, that something big is going to happen at a small window of opportunity. And you could look at it from a number of different strands of this fuse that is burning toward the break in history, and the initiation of the Common Era. And as I look at that, I think, okay, well, so isn't it amazing how many times have you thought about how explosively quick and fast and robust the expansion of Christianity was in the first 2 or 3 centuries, and a lot of why Christianity was able to travel, was able to expand at the rate it did, was because there was a unique point in history in which there was an empire in place that provided the mechanisms by which the message of Jesus could be transmitted quickly. I mean, Paul walked and traveled on roads that were not available to anyone who wanted to walk and travel on those roads just a few centuries prior. Those were available largely because an empire had come in, the Roman Empire, and had it constructed those roads, and it constructed them in a way in which they became masters of bridges and tunnels, because for the most part, the armies and the machinery they were trying to push down those roads could not make sharp turns. So they couldn't go around things the way they would have liked to. So they knew they had to go through things and go over things. And they built probably one of the largest collections of tunnels and bridges in the ancient world. And a lot of that money that was spent on roads was spent because of the stability that the Roman Empire provided. It defeated its enemies pretty quickly, and there was a 200-year period of peace called the Pax Romana that provided the ability to kind of reallocate funds toward things like roads. So you could build roads because you weren't spending these things in wars, spending this money in wars. And so not just that, but just the Etruscan alphabet that they adopted, the form of Greek that was adopted, all of the language skills that we have in place. Even, if you look at just when, for example, papyrus was available in antiquity. It seems that all of history is aligning culturally toward the ability to, number one, write down and document truth claims, and then transmit them quickly across long periods of long stretches of distance within the empire. These things happen to come into place in that first century window in which Paul then has a message he wants to deliver. He's able to deliver that message because the cultural context is such that the delivery was possible and actually even facilitated by the Roman Empire.
And again, that's all part of what you might call the cultural sphere or fuse. And again, you go into all sorts of sub-parts of that. But I want to keep moving because we want to get to another one, and that's the spiritual fuse, because that gets into the question that has surfaced sometimes in various atheist forums, and I've run into it on college campuses, that, well, really the whole story of Jesus is a copycat. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and this idea that somehow all of the attributes of Jesus have been straight and directly copied from ancient mythologies that preceded Jesus in one way or another. And if you really examine the ancients and examine the mythologies that are produced by ancient cultures, you'll see that while there are some very broad similarities, and there are, the details are always dramatically different. So you might say, well, look, this deity over here had the ability to defeat death, but the way in which that deity defeats death is entirely different than the way Jesus does. Or this deity over here appears miraculously, but the way that he appears miraculously is very different. So what is it about the similarities in ancient mythology? So here's what I had time, so I just read through, and I had done this before, but I really tried to be much more robust this time, reading through all of the ancient mythologies twice, trying to look for, like, what is similar between all ancient mythologies, in the Persian and the Asian and the Greek and Roman, even in southern hemisphere of the Americas. You look at these ancient mythologies and you ask yourself a question: are there certain commonalities? So in other words, do the ancients hold similar expectations of God that then find expression when they start thinking and writing stories about what they think God might be like in their mythologies? Well, don't be surprised that, yeah, as a matter of fact, as humans have thought about God, we think about God in similar ways. And these 15, I've identified 15 different similarities between the ancient mythology. Now, don't get me wrong. Not all 15 similarities appear in each mythology, right, but these are the 15 dominant themes that maybe your myth might have 6 or 7 or 8 of these, or the most that anyone has is like 10 of these, right? But these are the 15, and I lay them out in the book for you visually so you can see them. What's amazing to me is at the end of all this history of mythologies comes a historical figure who is said to possess all 15 of these attributes. He's the only one who possesses all 15 of the common ancient expectations of humans who are thinking about God. Now, why would that be the case, right? It's not just that. I mean, if you look at the types of Jesus that preceded Jesus, from Moses to David, and I go to do this in the book in great detail. I give you all of the common characteristics of the patriarchs of Judaism. You will see that there's also an expectation within Judaism. You could combine the descriptions, the rough outlines of Moses and Jonah and Joshua, and you can combine these rough outlines, and you'll get a pretty robust description of what sounds like Jesus, because roughly they are very similar in some ways to what Jesus was like. So the question then becomes, why would this be the case that there is an expectation of the ancients and an expectation of the Jews that then is personified in the person of Jesus? It's almost as though you're looking at what Paul is saying in Acts 17, where he says, you people are pretty religious. You've got all kinds of monuments, or even a monument to the unknown God. But I am here to tell you who truly is the God you've been anticipating, the God that you have been imagining about. I can tell you who he really is. And he demonstrated this because he rose from the dead. And so this is what I think Paul was doing on Mars Hill. And so if you look at this, as you see the similarities, I no longer see the similarities between ancient mythologies and Jesus as a liability. Instead, what I see happening is that it's always this way. When the expector, looks to expect something, you want to match the expectations of the expector. So if the expected matches the expectations of the expector, you get a wonderful response. And if you don't match the expectations of the expector, you get a hesitant response. If you wanted to, why would you be surprised that God would eventually appear and actually meet the most robust version of the expectations of people who are inclined to think about him anyway? They're thinking about God, and he shows up, and he meets some of those expectations, but he does it in the most robust way, in ways that most of them can't imagine, because they've only imagined a piece of the pie.
Let's, if we can, take a break. Let me just mention that one of the other fuses, which is actually mentioned in the expectation, is the prophetic fuse. So we'll talk about that. Then, of course, Jesus arrives, and then we'll get into the fallout. But if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more about this, first of all, you can, of course, pre-order the book. But also, we have a link to coldcasechristianity.com. That's on our website, pointofview.net, and you can find that there. And, of course, if you'd like to know about the book, we have a link to all of these different books, Cold Case Christianity, of course, Cold Case Christianity for Kids, God's Crime Scene Alive, and of course, this one that we are talking about today, which is Person of Interest. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the prophetic fuse. And so we have a cultural fuse, a spiritual fuse, a prophetic fuse. Jesus arrives. Then we have the fallout, and that gets into the dissemination, the imagination, education, exploration, exaltation, and then a postscript. And just a fascinating book, which again just illustrates the fact that as we look at the anticipation of Jesus coming and then him coming, we then see the profound influence that this person Jesus has made on Western civilization, art, music, architecture, history, philosophy, and much, much more. And it also helps answer that question that I used to get when I was on college campuses speaking, and that is, well, why should I pay attention to Jesus? Well, first of all, because he makes some pretty outrageous claims, and if they're true, they certainly have an impact on your life. But second of all, how could you be even culturally literate if you did not even understand who Jesus was, the profound influence of Christianity in Western civilization, and the influence he's had in individual lives? And so this book certainly goes into that detail. A Person of Interest. We'll talk more about that with J. Warner Wallace right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with J. Warner Wallace. The book is entitled Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. We've been talking about this concept of the fuse and the fallout, the fuse that is lit before the bomb goes off, and then the fallout. In this case, the fuse before Jesus arrives. And we've talked about the spiritual and cultural fuses, but one more, and that is the prophetic fuse. And that is very powerful because you have prophecy being fulfilled in the Old Testament, prophecy about a coming Messiah fulfilled in the New Testament, and you have nothing quite like that in any other religious literature.
Yeah, and I tried to do in this book. There's over it took me 3 months to do 400 illustrations for the book because to me it's so visual in the timeline, right? Like it's one thing for us to talk about it, but until you see it, until you see the window of opportunity that opens up as history kind of burns, this fuse burns toward the beginning of the Common Era, as you see it, it's really to me it was mind blowing. And what I tried to do with the prophecy was to say, look, we always talk about prophecy, and a couple things have always bothered me about it. I'll just be honest, I was never influenced by prophecy in my own investigation of Jesus because it seemed like people weren't always careful about how they organized the prophecies. Here's what I mean. A lot of Jewish believers will say, well, that prophecy you're mentioning wasn't even messianic. It wasn't even supposed to be about a becoming Messiah. You've misinterpreted it. Okay, whatever. So I think part of it for me was understanding and trying to help people to see that there are two kinds of evidences in crime scenes. Sometimes the evidence is really clear. It's DNA. It's going to identify the guy before I ever meet him, or a fingerprint. If it's in the database, it'll identify somebody before I ever meet them. Sometimes the evidence in the crime scene is not so clear. It's a button. I don't know where that button came from. I can't find a button missing from the victim, but I don't know if that button came from the suspect yet. But if I meet the suspect and I look at his shirt and he's missing a button, well, that could become very important evidence, but it doesn't identify him before I meet him. It only confirms he's my guy after I meet him. So some evidence is clear. It points to the guy before I meet him. Some is cloaked. It only points to him after I meet him and compare it to his shirt. And that is the same as true for prophecies. You'll see a lot of the prophecies that are described over time are either clear or cloaked. They're going to point to somebody beforehand that we ought to see and know it's him before he gets here. And some, like you'll see in some of the New Testament writers, will be pointing to prophecies that are more like the button. They make sense. They were cloaked, but they make sense once he appears. You can look at the button and say, yeah, it matches his shirt. That's the stuff that I thought was important to distinguish. And number two, as anyone, I don't know of anybody who has put the prophecies in the actual historical order in which they appear, because it turns out that part of the reason why Jesus appears when he does is because the most robust picture answering all of those investigative questions you answer, right? The who, what, how, when, where, those questions, you have to have all five answered before you can point to your bad guy usually. Well, it turns out that those five questions are not answered until you get right up to, to that period of time when the last prophet speaks about Jesus. Now you have the clearest possible picture. If you started off with the earliest prophecies about the Messiah, well, to be honest, they're not very specific. They don't give you a time frame. They don't give you a lot of information. It's not until you actually put them on the timeline and you see when they appear that you go, oh, well, now I see why Jesus came when he did. I mean, the most robust prophetic image of him is available just before he arrives.
And so, again, just great material in terms of the fuse. Of course, the middle chapter is the arrival of Jesus, and that gets us into the question that some people have, and that is, why did Jesus arrive then? Why didn't he come earlier? Why didn't he come later? In some respects, you've sort of already answered that, but before we get to the fallout, let's talk about what you call the divine timing of Jesus.
Yeah, there's a red zone that we identify in criminal trials. We ask the question, why did this happen in my city when it did? It could have happened any time, could have happened any place, but let's talk about time. Why did it happen? Why did she die on that day? Why did that bomb go? Why didn't it happen 2 weeks earlier? And you can identify why that red zone of opportunity occurred based on once you start collecting the evidence, you can see, well, yeah, we didn't have what he needed in place. He had to do this first, then he had to do that first, and he had to beat this deadline. So now I can see based on the deadlines and what he actually has in terms of materials, why it occurs when it does. Well, it turns out there's a similar red zone in history when it comes to Jesus, that things are in place. If all I had was the fuses, the three fuses, prophetic, the spiritual fuse, the cultural fuse we've described so far, if you overlap them, and I do this visually so you can see, you will see that a red zone opportunity emerges from about 29 BCE to about 70 BC or CE, or BC, 29 BC, and 70 AD. That window of opportunity of about 100 years is when everything aligns perfectly, so that you've got the prophets. Daniel tells us that the Messiah will show up before the destruction of the temple. Well, that puts an end cap on it of 70 AD. And then you have all of the cultural fuses that provide the opportunities with roads and peacetimes and language and papyrus and all the things you need in order to propagate the message. Those come in place at a certain time. And if you want to come onto planet Earth at the time when the expectations of ancients who are thinking about God are most robust, you've got to appear when all of these systems are still in place and people are still worshiping these myths. Then you show up and you're just like, oh my goodness, this is the best. This is actually the God we were thinking about. Well, all of those windows end up aligning into a 100-year open opportunity from 29 BC to 70 AD. And when do you think all of history changes? It changes right there in the middle of that window. And then the question becomes, well then, so what caused that transition? Is it a person? Is it an event? And so now but at least you've got a place to focus. And I think when people see that red zone in history, they will be blown away by how tight it is around the life and ministry of Jesus.
Again, the red zone, 29 BCE to 70 CE. Of course, that is the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then, in the last remaining time that we have, let's talk about the fallout, because up until now we've had the fuse and then the fallout. And one of those is the issue of dissemination, because now this message is spread throughout the Roman Empire and ultimately throughout the world. And we see it showing up in history. We see it showing up in movies. We see it showing up in so many different elements, and it's a good argument for why a skeptic would say, well, why should I study Jesus? Because he is the most significant person still in terms of the amount of information about him. It's probably the longest particular entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica, if you still have one of those on your shelf. It is certainly the individual that has had greater influence in Western civilization than anyone else, in a sense, gave us Western civilization. So what should we know about that?
Well, there's a lot of good books that are out there that talk about the impact that Jesus has had. I didn't want to focus so much on that. I'm an investigator, so my question is, what aspects of the world in which we live today not only have been influenced by Jesus and his followers, but can provide us with the data, the specific data from which we could reconstruct accurately the story of who was in that crime scene. And so what I'm looking for is not just the aspects of culture that he influenced, but what do those aspects of culture tell? Let's give you an example. This literature is huge, right? So you can look at all the voices in antiquity who said something about Jesus, and I've given the most robust list of ancient voices, both Christians, non-Christians, pagans, Greeks, Persians, Jews, anyone who talked about Jesus in the first 300 years. I've got them all listed. They're all in the case notes as well. But from that, can you reconstruct the story of Jesus just from people who spoke about him? Yeah, of course you could. Yes. But it's not just that. Look, the things as an atheist that I valued the most, because I was artistic. I was working as an architect. I valued literature, art, music, education, science. Well, it turns out those 5 things that most atheists value are deeply indebted to Jesus and his followers. And from those 5 aspects of culture, you can systematically reconstruct every detail of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. I mean, you would not believe the amount of detail. I list it in the book, so you can see it. It's all in the footnotes, too. Because the idea here is not just, did he have an impact? And it's not just on the West. If you look at art globally, if you look at literature globally, if you look at music globally, it is indebted to Jesus of Nazareth and his followers. I mean, the top 15 universities across the world today were all initiated by Christians. Now, they may not be venerating Christ on those campuses today, but here's what's interesting. If you just visited those top 15 universities and focused on the images that are on the buildings, you can reconstruct the story of Jesus, because it turns out those were initially Christian campuses. Wow. And I go through that and show how you can reconstruct the story of Jesus just by looking at the buildings and charters of the top 15 universities in the world today. So it's really going to be hard to destroy the information related to Jesus, unless, of course, you're willing to destroy most of art history, music history, the history of education, and the buildings involved in education. and the history of science. You'd have to destroy all of that data to get rid of Jesus and all of the information we have about Jesus.
Again, a lot of that's in the final chapters here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a little more detail in that regard. But you can begin to see how much external evidence, as we like to call it, that points to Jesus Christ. We'll continue our conversation about the person of interest right on this particular break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with J. Warner Wallace for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Person of Interest, published by Zondervan, about 300 pages. And we've talked a little bit about some of the influence. And again, you were looking at whether or not you could reconstruct the story of Jesus from the fact that he dominates bookshelves, that he is certainly the source for so many movies, for so many areas of music. You, of course, talked about the issue of education and what has happened there and the founding of various schools, and then even whether or not Jesus was a science denier, because when you look at the remarkable growth of what today we call the scientific method, you see that developing from people who either were Christians or in some cases were at least theists. So all the way through the various investigation that you've done, these fallout features point back to something very significant that happened because of the birth, death, and, of course, resurrection of Jesus that influenced all of history.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I was researching all of the important scientists over the course of history and just separating them out into categories. I had a research assistant who helped me with this. And as I was reading through this, I realized, a lot of these folks are like the science fathers. They'll say that the father of this discipline, the father of modern chemistry, the father of quantum mechanics, the father of this or that. And I thought, wow, a lot of Christians have, we went back through all of them again and looked at who are identified as the fathers of their disciplines. And then I read through, and you got to see it in the book to see how many people I'm talking about.
Oh, yes.
I tried to illustrate it. It's ridiculous, okay? So I put all that out there. And then I went back and I read the personal notes and the personal journals of these fathers of the sciences. Now, of course, some of these fathers are actually women. It's just an expression they're used, like the initiator, the first in the series of people investigating this modern scientific discipline. And I went back and read through all of their journals. The most robust reconstruction of the Jesus story from all aspects of culture actually comes from the science fathers, because we have initiated virtually every significant discipline in the sciences had at its beginning a Christ follower who was doing that work and initiating, and that's just not deniable. And we've won more Nobel laureates in the sciences are from are people who held a Christian worldview. The biggest impact, we have to make a decision. Are we going to continue to have this kind of impact in the sciences? Because we have historically, the entire scientific revolution was led by Jesus followers. And people will say, well, yeah, but in the 16th and 17th century, that's all there was Jesus. But no, that's not true. That's not true. We were outnumbered globally by all kinds of other groups. Yet those groups did not start the scientific revolution. It happened in Europe, in Christendom. Why? Why is Christendom leading it? It could have been easily, we're outnumbered by people in many other places on the globe, but they did not lead in the sciences. It turns out that there are, I think, 5 or 6 things I show you in the book that are catalysts for science that come out of a Christian worldview that began the firestorm. Jesus stands at the beginning of that tremendous growth curve in the sciences. He doesn't stand in the middle or thousands of years before. It's once Jesus shows up, you'll see in the chart that I provide for you that there's an explosion of scientific activity. It's either coincidence or he's a catalyst in some way. I think the better evidence is that he's a catalyst.
And one of the things I found so interesting about that was the number of individuals in some of these disciplines that most people have never heard of that you go through in such incredible detail. And even though I've written on this as well, the rise of the scientific method, it was based in large part because of a worldview that said, we believe there is an intelligent God, and we believe that because of that, there should be design in nature, and we then, with our intelligent minds, can discern the mind of the Creator. And if you start with the assumption that the entire world is an illusion, which might be an Eastern philosophy, you're not going to do that kind of investigation. If you start with the assumption that there is no truth, postmodernism, you're never going to be trying to find these various theoretical ideas. So this chapter is so significant as well, including the fact that 65.4% of all the Nobel Prize winners are Christ followers. And then number 2, which is no surprise, Jewish, 21.1%. And so you can begin to see that this whole idea that you hear on college campuses today that I run into all the time is, well, I'm a Christian and I believe in science, so I'm going to have to reject my Christianity in order to embrace science. That was certainly not a dichotomy or a false choice that existed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and that is something we need to recapture. So you've done a very good job of that as well. So just before...
And one of the things, too, I wanted to say that it's not changed. I extended out past Darwin into the 20th century and into the 21st century. There's a robust list of living scientists. It's a myth to assume that Christians have now abandoned the sciences. But you're right. The potential is there because it's about who are we going to raise the next generation of scientists, and we need to do that for sure.
Well, and that's why I wanted to get to the point just before we run out of time, and that is your website, because first of all, you have some great material for coldcasechristianity.com, but you have a lot to really encourage young people. And oftentimes when I have somebody say, Can you recommend a good book? I've only got a young person, so they're maybe not quite ready for some of these more academic books you talk about in terms of apologetics. I say, well, then I would highly recommend Cold Case Christianity for Kids, in which they can investigate Jesus with a real detective. So you've got material for every age group, and this new book coming out, you've got all sorts of additional material. So talk about what people will find when they land on your website.
Yeah, I hope they do. Join us there at coldcasechristianity.com. And we've got a book just for the launch. It's just personofinterestbook.com. And what we're trying to do is provide all kinds of free stuff. Look, as an atheist, if you were trying to sell me a book, I figured that's what you're really all about. You just want to sell me a book. So I'm always sensitive to that idea. So I think if we're going to provide a book, we want to say, okay, yeah, this is going to cost something because that's the way books are. But I want to provide free videos, ebooks, Bible inserts, other materials, and we do that for anyone who pre-orders the book at personofinterestbook.com, because we really are saying, hey, I get it. Exhaust what you can for free before you actually step out to spend money. But it's just really hard, as you can see in that book, Kerby. It's hard to talk about this in a robust way, visual way, without writing a book like this. And so in the end, if you want to deep dive, if you want to be able to make the case, you have to be able at some point to start with a book. So that's the way it works, you know. So, but we do have some great resources there at personofinterestbook.com.
Well, if nothing else, next time we do this, I'm going to try to figure out a way to get some of these diagrams on the screen so that people can see this, because I'm sure you will do even better on television interviews, because showing some of these diagrams are worth the price of the book, and you've spent an enormous amount of time not only researching this, but drawing those and putting it together. And as always, we owe you an incredible debt of gratitude for the time and effort that you've put into any of your books, but especially this new one, Person of Interest. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and as always, I look forward to the next opportunity.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm indebted to you.
Again, J. Warner Wallace, and if you find yourself saying, okay, what was that website again? Well, it's coldcasechristianity.com. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, I don't have a chance to write that down. Well, we have it at our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we just mentioned personofinterest.com. We'll have all those links for you as well. And they're all available so that you can find out more about not only that book, but some of the other books that he has published in the past. We, of course, have interviewed him, so if you'd like to hear some of the previous interviews on Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, or, of course, this one that we did today on Person of Interest, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net, and it's all part of an attempt to help you know how to make the case for Christianity. And he starts with an incredible challenge about trying to have a murder case without a body. How about trying to talk about Jesus without even the New Testament? And look what he was able to do, showing once again the abundance of evidence that points to the fact that Jesus was indeed who he claimed to be, and he is certainly worthy of our faith and our belief. That's all we have for today. I hope you appreciated the conversation. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.